This week it's been getting hotter and hotter, but with the help of a machine, a companion for a couple of days, and plenty of water, I've been pushing myself hard. This is what I've been up to. This week I've had a couple of important meetings that I'll tell you about later, but my main focus has been on trying to finish as much of the excavation work as possible in the last two rooms where I want to lower the level of the floor. And to help break up some of the bigger and harder rocks, I rented a demolition hammer, which I hooked straight up to the generator and got straight into action. For all of the excavation work this week, after breaking up the surface, I then had to move the material, lift it into the wheelbarrow, and then transfer it outside, just like in this sequence. For most of this video, I've left out a lot of the shoveling and wheelbarrowing, but there was a lot of it. Most of the rock in this room was breaking up into small pieces, so there wasn't much point in trying to chip out any larger rocks for using later. So to start with, most of my work was with the hammer. But for the edges nearer the wall, I used the pickaxe initially to make sure I didn't break up the rock beneath the wall. When I was editing this work, it was hard to show the impact of the hammer apart from when I increased the speed. So in this video, there are a few more accelerated clips than usual. In this sequence, I had actually forgotten the camera was on, but it probably better reflects the slowness of some of my work, my poorer posture off camera, and moments of exhaustion. Using the hammer definitely made the surface breakup work quicker, but it typically required much more difficult picking up work. Often that had to be done by hand. You may notice some of the sudden changes to the rocks on the floor, and that's because in between the hammering there actually was a lot of picking up, shoveling and wheelbarrowing going on. I was hoping to finish this corner on the first day, but an even more important priority for the day was to get to my Spanish lesson in time. The next day, I got things set up and then had a fairly long and productive meeting with my architect and the builder from the last phase of work. We were reviewing the exact options for finishing the floor excavation work, especially the design for the concrete that will be needed at the base of all of the walls. And we also discussed possible sequences and timing of some further work by the building team. My work in this room had produced more small stones than I had expected, and I'd got to the stage where I needed to make some changes to the dumping area outside. So next up, I had to clear a bit of a path in the stones to make sure I could get the wheelbarrow to the edge. Then, after clearing more of the wall edge, I stopped for some lunch, for most of which I was joined by some swallows that I imagine were looking for nest options. They weren't the easiest to capture on film, but I gave it a go. After a final clear up of the wall edge, I moved on to taking out the drainage structure that I had found last week. The whole upper section of bricks and tiles was still in pretty good condition, but I'm sure it must have caused a lot of moisture to enter the rock foundations and floor in this room. After removing the materials on top, I then carefully hammered out the rock that they had been built on top of. And after a tidy up of this room, I moved on to preparing for working in the next room by carefully removing the dirt and rocks in the doorway so that I could have a ramp into and out of it during the work. From the third day of the week, Billy was back on site, both as head of security and also as my new digging buddy. After showing him what the work involved, he initially opted for some extra rest. So I was back to working alone on opening up the entrance space in this front room so that I could get the shovel board and wheelbarrow in more easily. The noise of the rocks going into the wheelbarrow seemed to have woken up Billy, so before our lunch break, we had a short run and play outside in the sun. Before a lunch at the indoor table, and then going back to work. It was becoming increasingly clear that there were 2 or 3 very different seams of rock in this room. To the right was a seam that was breaking up quickly into small square stones, and to the left was a big tough seam which was really hard to break into unless you hit an exact seam line. But when I did manage to do this, it was producing some very big rocks that will be really useful in the future. Both some bigger slate-style slabs and some bigger solid rectangular rocks. After clearing a reasonable space in the entrance of this room, it was time for a drinks break, or for Billy, a chew stick break. For the rest of the day, I worked hard on excavating deeper in the first part of the room. The next day started with a bit of a tidy up, and then I worked on digging a bit deeper still. When it was time for a drinks break, I asked Billy if he wanted to continue with his outside patrol or join me inside. It was actually hotter than the day before, and Billy spent most of the time indoors, where, because of the thick stone walls, it was considerably cooler. Although if you were working with a heavy demolition hammer and shifting tons of rock, it was warm enough that you had to drink a lot of water. After a long session breaking into the harder rock corner, it was time for a rest and some lunch. And then afterwards it was back for some tidying up. Before finishing a bit earlier than normal to freshen up for my meeting at the council to talk about the path proposal. The next day I was back into this room to see how much more I could dig out on this last day of the week. For the meeting with the council, my architect and I were not sure who we would be meeting at the council, and it ended up just being with the mayor. He was very welcoming, listened carefully, and made some very useful practical suggestions. I think the meeting went as well as it could do, and the mayor will come back to us next week with some updates. Back in this room, after some more clearing up, I dug out the left corner, which was a seam of slightly easier rock to shift. I then started some preparation work for clearing out the other corner of harder rock so that I could clearly see the seam lines I needed to break into. Before starting that work, it was time for a quick run outside with Billy. Some lunch indoors, and then some coffee and fruit in the shade outside. Then I was back inside to hammer into the hard rock corner. The hammer was really helping me break quite deep into the seams and enabling me to lift out some pretty big and heavy rocks, quite a few of which needed some pickaxe or crowbar assistance. And having broken up most of the corner, it was time for a final clear up of the week. I tried to persuade Billy to get more involved by bribing him with a chicken stick, but he was generally happier to watch and supervise what I was doing. And that was the last load of the week because I'm out of time. And as you can see from the pile of smaller stones here and the pile of much larger rocks here, I'm also just about out of space after putting maybe a couple of 100 wheelbarrow loads out there via what is now a pretty well-trodden route from the 2 rooms I've been working in. In this first room, the work I did clearing here, removing the old drainage channel, all seems like quite a long time ago. And I have got a bit more work to do in here. I've got to take off, I don't know, another 30-40 centimeters of rock out of here. But I'll only do that after I've finished in the room through here. Which, despite a big push this afternoon, I haven't quite finished, as I've got to dig out these last bits of rock here, the particularly hard ones here, being pretty careful not to get too close to the wall. And then I've actually got to do quite a lot more work lowering the level in here. But that's the last thing I'll do in this room so that I don't lose the ramp to get out. So while I haven't quite finished these 2 rooms, I'm very pleased with my effort. I've pushed really hard and I've taken out a heck of a lot of rock. And as I said earlier, I had 2 pretty good meetings. First of all, with the architect and the builder to discuss the next phase of work. And then with the council yesterday and the mayor. And as I said earlier, that went probably as well as can be expected. But I'll wait to see next week what comes from it. And next week, I hope to get on to the tasks that I want to do out here. And a priority is going to be to get some help to clear these rocks out of the way to create some space. And I'm not sure how many of those days Billy will be with me, but if he is, he'll be a very good companion. And either way, I hope to see you next week.